Hello, everyone. I'm Ken Morefield, the owner and current operator of the Arts and Faith website. And my guest on this podcast is Stephen D. Greydanus. Stephen is a longtime arts and faith participant, author, and now teacher. And he contributed a chapter to the recent book Film as Expression of Spirituality, the Arts and Faith Top 100 Films. Stephen, welcome. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Ken. It's good to talk to you.
So, first question that I typically ask all of the book authors who participate, what was the title of your chapter and why did you decide to write about the topic that you did?
So my chapter is called Faith, Reason, and Interpretation, Belief and Doubt in the Song of Bernadette and Lourdes. So I'm writing about Henry King's 1943, The Song of Bernadette, based on the novel by Franz Werfel, and Jessica Hausner's 2009 film Lourdes. And I was attracted to write about these two films for a number of reasons. As I'm arts and faiths resident Catholic film writer, I'm a Catholic deacon in the Archdiocese of Newark, and these are two films about a very Catholic subject. In fact, to a certain extent, about the same subject, about the world of the Marian apparitions at Lourdes, France, to a young girl named Bernadette Soubirous, and the shrine that was built there, and the healings that are ascribed to the waters of Massabielle. Um, they're from very different cultural milieus. The Song of Bernadette represents Hollywood's golden age and at its most pious and most Catholic, where Lourdes is a much more secular, modern out art house look at the world that resulted from the apparitions to Bernadette. I also wanted to write about Lourdes because arts and faith has historically not paid a lot of attention to films by women, and I wanted to
Agreed.
make sure that we got that in the book.
Mhm.
Um, and my approach to the spiritual resonances and the miraculous themes in the films from the perspective of interpretation reflects both my interest as a film writer in the interpretation of film, but also my growing appreciation as a believer for the role that interpretation plays in our faith lives. It's become more and more evident and important to me as a believer that to and particularly as a Christian, that when we look at the world from a Christian perspective, when we say, I believe that God is at work in the life and death of Jesus and in what we believe to be his resurrection, that these are interpretive statements. And the kind of pre-critical idea that I grew up with, that if you could document and demonstrate conclusively that Jesus rose from the dead, that would prove that Christianity is true, that this represents a kind of naive epistemology that I wanted to explore in this film, and to show that despite the very different milieus between the Song of Bernadette and Lourdes, that to a very significant extent, the world of interpretation lies between us and the films, and it's not really possible to draw a hard and fast line between them and say, well, this film is pious and this film
Mhm.
is not. It's much more ambiguous than that.
Okay, so I may flip-flop the question order that I sent you because you had mentioned Catholicism and being the sort of arts and faith resident Catholic, and that being one of the reasons that drew you to these two films. That makes sense, subject matter. The question I wanted to ask you is, since arts and faith as a message board and now a web page in various incarnations has been more ecumenical as
Yeah.
opposed to a particular denomination, did you approach writing this chapter as though you were writing for a Catholic audience, or did you write it any differently, imagining that, like, do you write differently for something that's explicitly for a Catholic audience, like National Catholic Register, versus something where you're writing as a Catholic writer, but you're maybe speaking to both Catholic and non-Catholic readers?
It's an interesting question,
Mhm.
and as a Catholic writer and a Christian writer, it's taken me a while to really figure out what my motive is and what I'm
Mhm.
trying to do in my film writing. But I think for a long time it's been evident to me that what I've always wanted to do, what I really wanted to do from the beginning, from when I founded my website, Decent Films, all the way back in the year 2000, was to write about movies as a Christian, but in a way that is intelligible and interesting to any interested reader,
Mhm.
whether they're Christian, whether they're Catholic or Protestant, some other religion, or a non-believer. I always felt like I had one foot in these two worlds, the world of faith and the world of cinephiles, and I felt like I understood people that didn't really understand each other. And
Mhm.
I've always been drawn to the role of a translator or a go-between. I've always wanted to make the perceptions and the expressions of different groups of people intelligible to one another. And
Mhm.
so I from a very early point in my work, I would sometimes jokingly say, I want to try to show movie viewers of faith that there might be value in watching an R-rated movie with subtitles other than The Passion of the Christ, while also
Mhm.
showing purely secular cinephiles that it might be possible to have a theological objection to the last temptation of Christ that's not rooted in censorious fundamentalism.
Mhm.
And so even when I was at the National Catholic Register, I always tried to keep in mind how would a Muslim reader, or how would a
Mhm.
reader who's not of faith, how would they read this,
Mhm.
and to address them. And I've in this essay in particular, I'm really trying to look at, how could I watch a movie like The Song of Bernadette from the perspective of having no faith at all? Like, does the
Mhm.
movie make sense if I say God is not in this movie?
Mhm.
And then similarly, how can I explain to someone like Jessica Hausner how I can watch a movie like Lord from the perspective of faith?
Mhm. That's very interesting. I would just say as a slight tangent, it resonates very much with me what you talked about in terms of feeling like you occupied a space in which you understood two parties that didn't understand each other. Because I certainly felt that way early in my career, both as an academic, and a writer. Um, and I think what I eventually found out was that I didn't understand, like, I understood the movie people more than I understood the religious, people. I didn't really understand both parties. I only really understood one of them, and it wasn't the one that I thought that I understood because, as much as I identified myself as Christian, I didn't come out of that tradition. I mean, I was Protestant, not Catholic, but I didn't come out of that fundamentalist tradition. So I didn't share, or I had never experienced so many of the assumptions that they had.
Mhm.
And I think if I look back on some of the early like film writing, it it seems to me to be more like an academic argument than an exercise in actually talking to the audience. Um, because and I mean an academic argument that I'm still like, yeah, this is why this movie is good, or why it's doctrinal, or I understand that. But that's a very different conversation than this is why you might get something out of it, or this is why you might value it, or this is why you might not. So that's a really tricky audience to try to get down, and it's a really commendable thing. Um, to try to expand the way that you interact. When you watch the films, do you have to do that? Can you do that both at the same time, or do you have to like watch it once, imagining it from the Catholic perspective and then from the non-believer perspective, or do you experience both at the same time?
Hmm. That's a really interesting question. Think I think what happens over time is that I've learned more to process a movie on different levels than I was once able to. I think in the past I would have had to watch a movie repeatedly in order to
Mhm.
think about it different ways. But as you go along, one of the things that happens when you are in dialogue with multiple partners is that you begin to live with those voices in your head.
Yeah.
This is certainly this one of the things that I think has been of great benefit to me as a parent, watching and writing about family films, is that, I would go to see movies or I would show movies to my kids or I would take them to screenings, but at a certain point I would just have their voices living in my head, and I
Mm,
could see how a 12-year-old or an 8 year
right.
old would respond to a movie, and I hope that I do that with some integrity when I watch movies and I think about the people that I've learned from, about, having a conversation about movies who have no faith at all, or who have a faith that's very different from mine.
Right. Before I ask you about spiritually significant, I do want to maybe address a question or two about the actual films, Lords
Mhm.
and Song of Bernadette. Um, when I was thinking about Song of Bernadette, it surprised me in going through all of the arts and faith various top 100 lists where it's always been there.
Hmm.
But I think if maybe correct me if you think I'm wrong. I think if you took the average long-term arts and faith participant, that core of like maybe 20, 30 people who were from the website towards the beginning in various iterations and said, what are the core, you know, 20 films that are on every arts and faith list, they would, immediately go to Malick and the Dardannes and the Bresson and, Tarkovsky or whatnot. And then maybe eventually would get around to like one of those films like Tender Mercies, which is somehow no one ever really talks about in the arts and faith circles, but ends up on every list or whatever. Um, so, you know, I was surprised to be reminded when I was prepping for this that it's like that film has been on every list. It's never really been up near the top. It's always just sort of been somewhere there. Um, what is it that you think has made it so um enduring amongst the arts and faith crowd as reputations of various, of various of the, sort of like top 20 have
Sure, sure.
rise and fallen. And you had mentioned something on social media recently that you thought Song of Bernadette was a harder film than it's given credit for, or a more
Uh,
serious film.
a,
And
a
I
more a
just
more
wonder if you could say
tough-minded
something
film.
about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that the Song of Bernadette is really the crown jewel of pious Hollywood's golden age, and the competition is not fierce. Um, as a
Yeah.
Catholic film writer, one of my guiding lights in my work has always been a 1995 list of movies published by the Vatican, by the Pontifical
Mhm.
Council for Social Communications and the Pontifical Council for Culture. 45 films in, three categories: 15 in the category of arts, 15 in the category of values, and 15 in the category of religion. And they tried to be very Catholic, lowercase c, and including contributions from world cinema the world over in each of the
Mhm.
categories, and representing the various eras in film history, silent film up to the modern era, and so forth. But what's very interesting is that of the 15 films in the religion category, the only Hollywood film is Ben-Hur, which just really goes to show that when you're looking at
Mhm.
spiritually serious cinema, America has not historically made a lot of those movies. Certainly not
No.
not in the golden age. I think that there was too much. I think that the production code and the insistence that, religious authorities could never be portrayed in a negative light, and various other restrictions really kind of inhibited the development of spiritually serious cinema, in Hollywood at that time. What I think makes the Song of Bernadette different is significantly the source material, the novel by Franz Werfel. Werfel was Jewish, and
Mhm.
he was very interested in the story of Bernadette. He spent time in Lourdes while he and his wife were trying to escape to the United States. Um, um, from the Nazis, and he writes in the introduction, I believe, making a pledge to the Virgin Mary that if he should in fact escape, that he would attempt to sing the Song of Bernadette in novel form. Um, so so the fact that the story was first told, I think in a fairly objective way by someone
Mhm.
who was not himself a Catholic believer, lends the film, in spite of what is certainly a thick layer of Hollywood sentimentality, a certain tough-mindedness,
Mhm.
represented, for example, in the fact that the first miracle that we see, or the first alleged miracle, the stonecutter, whose eyesight has been injured, Bouriette, played by Sig Rudman, um, is when the doctor examines him, it appears that the scratch in his cornea is unchanged, and the
Mhm.
doctor feels that he's just irritated the optic nerve by pressing on his eye in an attempt to heal himself, and now he's kind of hysterically convinced himself that his vision has gotten better. And the
Mhm.
movie even includes a kind of comic moment later where he's claiming that he can see everything, and then you see him fumbling for his trowel while they're building the stone wall around
Mhm.
the spring. And so the movie really raises the question, is this a real miracle?
Mhm.
There's also a moment late in the film where a man who really wants to believe that his cough has gotten much better, the last alleged miracle that we have any witness, the man is still coughing, and so there's
Mhm.
a real question as to whether this cure has really lasted. There's only one on-screen recovery that is dramatic, based on the real
Mhm.
life case of a boy named Justin Bourreau, who was one of the first people to be healed at the waters at Lourdes, and who lived into his 70s and saw the real Bernadette Soubirous canonization at that time as an old
Mhm.
man. And even his recovery is described by the priest as ambiguous.
Mhm.
So it's certainly possible to watch the movie and say, is this all a lot of hysteria about nothing?
Mhm.
And the movie then ultimately becomes not a celebration of the power of God, but a
Mhm.
celebration of the faith and the simplicity and the integrity of this young girl, Bernadette, who believes that she has experienced something powerful, and who sticks to her story in spite of great pressures, and that admiration for her personal virtue rather than for the power of God becomes the focus of the film. And this is partly how, in the words of an old saying, that Golden Age Hollywood was a Jewish-owned business selling Catholic spirituality to Protestant America. This is how that transaction works.
Mhm. That's a really good, that's a really good answer um, to both parts of the question, even though it's more the second part of the question, but it addresses the first part of the question, which is the function of Song of Bernadette on the arts and faith list. Because I think, when I think about advocates for Golden Age of Hollywood on the list, I mean, I think primarily of you and, Darren Hughes, who, in later years had, championed some of Leo McCarey's films, and, some other films when, some of the rest of us had maybe just sort of coalesced around the, Schrader transcendental definition of world cinema that sort of looked at spirituality as in opposition to um you know classical or golden age Hollywood cinema, rather than manifested in a different way. So that leads me into my last question, which is, the subtitle of the book is The Arts and Faith, Top 100 Films. In various incarnations of the list, the term spiritually significant has been used and then dropped and then used and then dropped. And every time we run every time I run one of the lists, or the top 25, or even the ecumenical jury, I always get questions from new people in terms of like, well, what's the criteria? What makes a film spiritually significant? Can you say something briefly about like what that term means to you, if anything,
Sure.
or how it informs the way that you see suitability for the arts and faith list or a book like this one?
I'm tempted to default to Justice Potter Stewart's famous line on obscenity, that I
Hmm.
know it when I see it. But to dig a little bit deeper, to me, spiritually significant has to do with a film foregrounding, and any film can lead
Mm.
to spiritual experiences.
Right.
When a film foregrounds questions of meaning, what it means to be human, and the quest for something beyond the empirical, that to me represents spiritual significance. So to give a couple of touchstones, I enjoy Steven Spielberg's Jaws
Hmm.
more than I do Close Encounters,
Hmm.
but Close Encounters is a spiritual film in a way that Jaws isn't.
Yeah.
I think Buster Keaton's The General is a great work of art, but Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times
Hmm.
explores questions of humanity and meaning and how we should live in a way that The General doesn't. I saw Young Frankenstein on a top 25 list of comedy films. Our top 25 divine comedies is led by Groundhog Day, and
Hmm.
those are I think that really illustrates the point. It's
Yeah.
the foregrounding of questions of meaning, of how we should live, of what it means to be human.
Right. Which is not to say that one cannot have a spiritual experience watching Jaws. And I think as a longtime voter or participant, sometimes those cuts, those films where you've had a spiritual experience, but the broader community has it because it's not foregrounded, makes it spiritually significant to you but not to other people. That those can be the hardest cuts because you want to, or I want to argue, the spiritual significance of, I'm trying to think of it, The Godfather. I've been trying for
Right.
20 years to get The Godfather on the list or whatever, and and it,
I'd be your ally in that. I'd
well,
be in
you're
favor of
right,
putting The
but
Godfather on the list.
there are some ways in which um, I've come to understand, at least you know some voters at least expressing a preference for something that foregrounds questions of spirituality or meaning for the majority of viewers rather than a strictly personal, whether that's personal to the individual or personal to the small group, works that says this has spoken to us and our experience and our lives in a particular way that maybe wouldn't to everyone else. So that's a good thought there. Um, any other questions, comments, anything that you want to add?
You raised a question offline about
Yep.
the 2020 list in particular,
Yes.
and
So so
how
the 2020 list limited voters to one film per director, in attempts you had mentioned earlier, in attempts to hopefully spur the inclusion of more female authors and more authors of color. And I was just wondering how you felt about that list, which was the formation, which was the impetus for this book, as opposed to previous lists. And that's now 5 years old. So um, whether how that list has grown on you or not, or how you think about it in comparison to other iterations of the top 100.
yeah. My own approach to list making tends to be a representative approach, right?
Okay.
So I want to include as many different kinds of movies as I can, and I select movies that I think will stand in for or represent a wider body of film. So it's obviously important on our list to have the Dardennes, to have Dreyer, to have Tarkovsky and Bergman and Bresson and so forth. But where I think that we've previously taken a more encyclopedic approach to including many films from those directors, the fact that we now have a movie like Do the Right Thing on this list,
Mhm.
and a film like Lord is important to me. I also want to say I'm very pleased to have Peter Weir's Witness back, a movie that is very important to me personally.
Mm. How come? I mean, how come the movie is important to you personally, or
So I've one of the essays that I'm the most proud of, and the essay that I wrote for your book is
Mhm.
one of the top 5 things that I've ever written that I'm the most proud of.
Mm.
But another one is my essay on Witness, which you can read at Decent Films. I find it
Mm.
to be a really fascinating meditation on belonging and not belonging to different worlds, and
Mm.
approaching the frontier between one world and another, and imagining yourself in a world that's not your own, and how John Book becomes as nearly Amish as possible at one point, and how Rachel becomes as nearly English as possible, and,
Mm.
and what that means, and how each world illuminates the other, and how we see the strengths and the weaknesses of the two worlds. I think it's
Mm.
a very profound film, and also a movie that just crosses a whole bunch of genres, as a romance, a thriller, a exploration of religious differences,
Mm.
of nonviolence. Just a really well constructed and interesting movie, and one that I saw.
Yeah.
I have to say the fact that I saw it at the point in my life as a teenager when I did it was very formative for me.
Yes, that happens to all of us, the particular time we see it. So Stephen had mentioned that he lent his copy of the book to his mom, so he doesn't have it in front of him. But the chapter on Witness, Witness is not only back in the list, but it's in the book.
Mhm.
It's an essay by Will Underland and Jency Wilson called "Reverse Rumspringa," Peter Weir's Witness as Cultural Kamikaze. Um, a wonderful little essay. Neither Will nor Jency were members of the arts and faith community, so they joined on for the book when they heard about the writing project. But it's a really cool essay in which, um, they talk about almost film as being this sort of tourist activity, the attempt to dabble in other people's cultures and visit other people's cultures and other people's lives, in a way that is not like actually in real life, but is somehow, um, y- you know, uh,
And you
I don't
get
want to say
that
morally problematic because that's overly stating it, but
morally fraught, though.
yes, is is
Yeah,
is is morally
it's a
fraught because it's still sort of treating the other as being, you know, this Orientalist exotic thing that is, that we are visiting for our pleasure in basking in our otherness or in making us feel morally superior, like I'm taking an interest in other cultures, when it's like, really, you're just kind of, you're using that as, as a means for your entertainment. And
and
how.
it does I was just going to say it does something very similar to Hitchcock's Rear Window in that regard,
Mhm.
where it implicates us in tourism, but it also highlights the problematics of that. You have the
Yeah.
line from Rachel, like the tourists. They
And
come to the yard, and it's very.
right. And so I was really, it's funny, I was kind of indifferent to witness, that's the good thing about lists like this, right? Is that they spur people who haven't viewed things to view them, and people like me who have viewed them to maybe view them again or think of them. Like, I hadn't thought about Witness in many, many years. And then after reading the essay, I went back and looked at the film and I was like, yeah, this is more complex than I remembered it being. There's more going on there. I got so much pushback you had mentioned on Do the Right Thing, and like, okay, well, why is Do the Right Thing spiritual? Or what is it that's spiritual? You know, that um, the good thing about lists like that is that hearing from other voices and different voices cannot just um inform you about things you don't know, but it can also make you think again about things that you think you do know, or that, and Witness was definitely one of those films that I thought I knew or whatever. And then enough people voted for it, and then I got this essay for it, and then I was like, you know, well, okay, maybe there's more here going on than I just remembered. And so that's a real pleasurable aspect of the list as well. I mean, it's always pleasurable when you hear some film that you'd never heard of and you're like, how did I not know about that? But it's also equally pleasurable to be like, oh yeah, that got me to take another look at that, or reassess that, or think about it in a different way than I might not have otherwise. So, um, which is a way of saying that I'm probably going to revisit Song of Bernadette at some point. I've seen Lourdes more recently, because that's always been a favorite, but it's been a while since I had looked at that. Um, and I want to try to do it with the exercise of like, okay, how would this look to someone who was a non-believer, or and maybe become a little bit more aware of the ways it differs than like some of the faith films of today that I would all tend to lump into the same category as saying maybe there's more there going on than just, the celebration of piety, and the things that we believe. So, um, Stephen, thank you very much for sharing your time and your insight, and for your essay. The name of the book is "Film as an Expression of Spirituality: The Arts and Faith Top 100 Films," and there will be a link to purchase in the comment section of YouTube and at the website. Academic book, so it's published for, price for libraries. But if you can't afford it, reach out via interlibrary loan, and really any good college library should be able to have an interlibrary loan agreement where they will let you check out the book and read it without having to shell out the big bucks. So, any parting comments?
No, I just want to say it's been a pleasure, and it's been really good to talk to you.
All right.